Horror. Despite the fact that this genre of cinema is about 130 years old, it still has a huge number of fans. Of course, first of all, because it is really loved by thrill seekers and it also entertains the viewer. But not only because of that. Horror is the most topical and free genre of modern cinema.
How did it happen? Today on the About Movies channel, we are going to answer this question. For this purpose, we will need to recall the best horror films of the 2010s, as well as one very popular TV series that uses elements of horror.
And at the end, we will make a little bonus. There, you'll find out the top horror movies that you should also watch. Make the subscription button white, click on the bell to be the first to receive interesting content about movies. Subscribe and we'll start. Since its birth, the horror genre has been a haven for aesthetes and visionaries. German expressionist directors turned scary stories into a game of shadows. Italians Dario Argento and Mario Bava did not want to scare the viewer so much, but experimented with light and color. The British, from Hammer Film Productions, created a standard of Gothic style on the screen. Even the author of the cult A Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream, Wes Craven, was more of an artist than a storyteller. Part of the reason for such an attraction of the genre for visionaries is in its strict plot framework. The victim must be weak, the evil must be mysterious, but the ending must be preferably open.
What's going on? Hey, I'm not doing it.
However, in recent decades, the strict genre framework has finally begun to blur. While cinemas are taken over by superhero blockbusters similar to each other and B-movies, the only genre that allows experiments and at the same time invariably attracts viewers has remained horror. Perhaps the most characteristic example of the new horror is Get Out by Jordan Peele. The film begins as a family comedy about the conflict of social groups and generations. The main character, a young African-American, comes to meet his girlfriend's white parents, and peaceful gatherings gradually turn into a horror movie that ironically plays out racial problems. Horror films at all times express the hidden fears of the population by which it was possible to measure the situation in society. From the red menace in science fiction of the 50s to the conservative turn in slashers of the 80s, where teenagers who drank alcohol and had sex were the first to die. So, it is not surprising that in the era of Black Lives Matter, horror was more accurate about racism than other genres in the United States.
By the way, I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could. Best president in my lifetime, hands down. I agree. Yeah.
Horror films not only speak about social problems, but also become a subtle study of psychological trauma. This is what the long-winded and at first look not scary films of Ari Aster are dedicated to. There's even a special term for this kind of movie, in which external attractiveness, like screamers, is not important. Slow burner. In Aster's debut film Hereditary, most of the timing is devoted to the main character's experience of the death of a loved one.
Yeah, fine, release me. Just say it. Just f***ing say it. Don't you swear at me, you little shit. Don't you ever raise your voice at me. I am your mother. Do you understand? All I do is worry and slave and defend you. And all I get back is that f***ing face on your face.
And the second film of the director, Midsommar, is at the same time a drama about depression and an honest conversation about codependent relationships. An exotic setting becomes an occasion for universal utterance, and Aster aesthetically hides all the murders in editing cuts. It is a luxury that seems to be possible only in independent filmmaking. However, the most successful studio horror of the decade, the film adaptation of Stephen King's It, about a group of teenagers who struggles with a scary clown, is also not so simple. On the surface, the film seems to be a formulaic horror with screamers and an unrealistic monster.
I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers.
Oh, well, I'm Pennywise the dancing clown. Pennywise? Yes, me, Georgie.
Nevertheless, it, like the original novel, speaks out on social topics, from domestic violence to racism. According to the film adaptation of King, one can trace another important sign of the decade. A horror film organically crosses with a teen melodrama on the background of nostalgia for the 80s. Horror is essentially the lingering genre. Its fundamental features can be called the desire to scare the viewer and the presence of supernatural characters, so a horror film can easily be planted to any genre soil and crossed even with comedy.
The point is, Deacon, that you have not done the dishes for 5 years.
Vladislav is right. It's unacceptable to have so many bloody dishes all over this bench like that.
I'm so embarrassed when people come over here.
What does it matter? You bring them over, you kill them.
For example, What We Do in the Shadows by Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement hilariously deconstruct myths about vampires using the mockumentary format stylized as a documentary. From a controversial comedy not far from a melodrama, the creators of the rom-com Warm Bodies place the classic story of Romeo and Juliet in the setting of the zombie apocalypse, and love turns out to be the answer to global dehumanization. But the studio hit A Quiet Place with John Krasinski and Emily Blunt in the title role is difficult to classify at all. This is science fiction about mysterious creatures and attempts to find weak points, and an adventure Robinsonade in which difficult situations constantly arise, and a piercing family drama primarily about the relationship of a father and daughter. A Quiet Place is most strongly associated with the horror genre because of a stylish, formalist technique. According to the plot, the characters try not to make a sound so as to not attract monsters with acute hearing. And here is the famous horror series The Conjuring, about a married couple of ghost hunters. It is nothing more than a detective story based on real events. S. Craig Zoller, the author of Bone Tomahawk, treats genre conventions no less radically. He boldly crosses a horror film with the traditional American Western genre. Slasher elements appear only in the finale to revive and deconstruct the plot tropes of cowboy films. The heroes, who went on a suicide mission, first travel for a long time through the Wild West, interspersing halts with Tarantino dialogues.
You watch how you speak to the law. Sheriff especially. You aren't captain.
No. I'm the most intelligent man here, and I intend to keep us alive.
Oh, you're the most intelligent man here. Is that a fact?
It is. Sheriff Hunt has a wife. So does Mr. O'Dwyer. And you're a widower.
Yeah. What has that got to do with anything?
Smart men don't get married.
And in the finale, they fight with cannibal Indians. And what scares in Tomahawk is not the mystery of evil, but its completely unnatural cruelty and bloodlust. The experiments of the authors of all these films with genres allowed the horror not to go into oblivion. The genre continues to develop and is still able to surprise the sophisticated viewer. It's interesting to find out what horror movie of the last decade impressed you the most. Share your opinion in the comments.
Horror elements are also actively used by the creators of the series. A striking example is the Duffer Brothers with their Stranger Things. This series does not focus on a specific genre. Elements of mysticism, horror, science fiction, detective, comedy, and drama are organically combined here. However, it is mostly science fiction, but the series also has plenty of horror elements, from the good old monsters from the other side and screamers to inhumane government experiments in the style of the Twilight Zone. In many modern horror movies, the source of fear is human unleashed nature. It is usually caused by a zombie virus or freedom, which is granted by wealth and power, as it was in Hostel or The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. In The Stranger Things, on the contrary, horror was an inhuman nature. It is hostile and unexplored. In one of the most tense scenes of the first season, the heroine of Winona Ryder hears her son's voice coming from the walls of the house. Tearing off the wallpaper, she discovers something alive and vile in place of the wall. We see how an alien dimension has suddenly taken root in the world we are used to. There has not been a house on the screen which is so artfully abnormal since the days of Poltergeist. In fact, the series takes us back to the days of classic horror monsters, but it does it organically so that viewers tired of the good old screamers still imbued with this frightening atmosphere. And this happens precisely because of the mixing of genres. For 2/3 of the series, we feel understatement and fear. However, we get a portion of humor, nostalgia, a detective component, and of course, the love showdowns of high school students between the elements of horror. When a monster appears, you are already quite ready to believe that monsters exist. By the way, the Demogorgon looks quite in the spirit of Guillermo del Toro's horror stories. The sound engineers of the series have tried on the sound design of the Upside Down so that we feel its danger literally on an instinctive level. If I may say so, the Upside Down sounds wet and slimy. The Demogorgon causes fear with his frantic scream. The creators noted that they admired the Predator when creating the sound design. We hear sounds of the Demogorgon even before we see it. You can hear a quiet ringing and a little extraneous noise, which becomes louder with the coming of the monster. This creates a classic suspense that prepares the viewer for the appearance of a monster. A distinctive feature of Stranger Things can be called a find with the sound of light bulbs connecting two worlds together. The sound engineer recorded these sounds using a charger and a voltage of 50 amps. Thus, it turned out to be a kind of non-synthetic, tense and frightening sound of electricity. And of course, it is impossible to ignore the fact that the atmosphere of Stephen King's books is buried in the DNA of the series. It is woven from realistic stories of the American outback, real-life tragedies that are scarier than horrors, and from a premonition of something dangerous. By 1983, when the film takes place, King had already written Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Dead Zone, The Stand, and The Shining. The topic of secret scientific research could easily get into the series from The Stand. The main character uses telekinesis without any problems, as well as King's Carrie. And Winona Ryder's heroine cuts down the walls with the same axe as Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Horror of the new time is more subtle than other genres with the dreamy essence of cinema. A typical example, the Australian horror film The Babadook. It is frightening but psychologically reliable. There can be two explanations for the devilry taking place in the plot. Either fantastic, an ancient monster is chasing a mother and son, or domestic and more probable. After the death of her husband and the birth of a child, the heroine loses touch with real life, and problems with a growing boy only aggravate her unstable condition. The line between fantasy and reality is barely discernible in the films of Michael Flanagan, the author of the popular The Haunting of Hill House. The heroes of his Oculus are brother and sister. They return to the house where a terrible tragedy occurred to deal with the mysterious mirror.
It was a bad marriage. Look how it ended up.
No.
Our father was a cheater, and it drove our mother crazy.
Stop it.
He snapped and he killed her. Was gonna do the same to us.
Oh, yeah. A bad marriage. That explains how Mom had no teeth, no hair, no mind left by the time she died.
But they get lost in the labyrinths of memory and begin to relive the events of the past, a transparent metaphor for post-traumatic syndrome. Finally, in the new century, horror can completely discard all conventions and be a zone of stylization of visual tricks and experiments. In The Lighthouse, Robert Eggers has no antagonists. The hero, played by Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe, just get drunk on the island and slowly go crazy. This does not make horror less scary, turning either into a creepy gothic fairy tale or into a subtle study of the male unconsciousness and the nature of insanity.
A bulging bladder no more, but a blasted bloody film now, a nothing for the harpies and the souls of dead sailors to pick and claw and feed upon, only to be lapped up and swallowed by the infinite waters of the dread Emperor himself.
Some more horror movies. What other horror films of the new time are definitely worth watching? We have chosen 5 films that, to some extent, have become a breath of fresh air for a separate franchise, direction, or even the horror genre as a whole. The Witch, a New England folktale, 2015. When everyone thought that good folk horror was forever in the past, Robert Eggers appeared. His The Witch is an example of a measured aesthetic horror film in which the form is scarier than the content. Irrational fear rules here, hiding in rustles, shadows, music, and oppressive shooting. Fortunately, The Witch did not become a one-time event. After its success, the interest of the public and authors in folk horror revived, which means that Eggers did something more within the genre than just made a good movie. Gonjiam, 2018. With the development of digital technologies, horror has received new themes that could be interesting to beat. Gonjiam is a mockumentary about bloggers who decided to stream from the scariest place in Korea. The form of a live broadcast, thanks to which it is easy to immerse yourself in the setting of an abandoned building, increases the feeling of claustrophobia and forces you to look at, perhaps, one of the most frightening movies of Korean cinema in the first person. The Cabin in the Woods, 2012. Drew Goddard and his debut movie hardly influenced the horror genre the way Wes Craven did with his Scream, but the deconstruction was still a success. Having collected a lot of archetypes and plots, the director skillfully mixed them into one story and made an ironic movie, which, for many, finally discredited hackneyed horror cliches like heroes in a house in the middle of the forest and antagonists who stopped scaring back in the distant 80s. Goddard talks about how a unique, frightening combination can arise from completely archaic images. Scream 4, 2011. You will probably say, in comparison with the films that were mentioned in the video, this one is so banal. And I will answer that, of all the sequels of the legendary Scream, only one part was able to reach the level of the original. Unlike the sequel and the triquel, the 4th chapter retains the perfect balance of comedy and suspense, for which Craven's brainchild was so loved. In addition, the approach of the plot itself is very interesting. Most often, directors shoot trilogies for the movies. If they tried to make a banal sequel for the 4th film, then they would immediately be thrown with Rotten Tomatoes. But it occurred to the director to reassemble a team of actors whose characters survived in the meat grinder of the first trilogy, and make them act according to the rules of a typical remake. And taking into account the fact that remakes of classics have become fashionable in the last 10 years, this film turned out to be very ironic. Train to Busan, 2016. Train to Busan in his native Korea broke all records, becoming the highest-grossing film in the history of the country. Director Yang Sang-ho has created a truly extraordinary picture in the genre of the zombie apocalypse. The film is fraught with a powerful satire on modern society. In extreme conditions, the heroes have to face not only the Walking Dead, but also the consequences of social and political stratification, which pushes the viewer to not the most pleasant conclusions about the true face of society. Horror of the 21st century is almost a new genre. It has much more Freudianism and subtexts, allusions and ambiguities, social criticism and postmodern play. And in the end, it scares more than the good old Scream and A Nightmare on Elm Street, because most often it reasonably emphasizes that the main evil is not a supernatural monster, but the people themselves. And I recently identified another incarnation of evil. This is the Disney Company. Why is that? You will find all the answers if you click on this icon that appeared on your screen. In my last video, I talked in detail about how this company drags money from our wallets and disappoints its viewers. Follow the link and watch. And that's all for today. Don't forget to like this video. About Movies was with you. See you later.